Behind every great nation, there's the leader that you know and the genius that you don't. For Singapore, the leader that everyone knows is Mr. Kuan Yew, and the genius that you don't know is Dr. Goh Keng Swee, the man that Lee Kuan Yew would be lost without. In fact, you don't have to take it from me. You can hear it from Mr. Lee Kuan Yew himself. He said that, of all my cabinet colleagues, it was this man who made the greatest difference to the outcome for Singapore. A whole generation of Singaporeans take their present standard of living for granted because he had laid the foundations of the economy of modern Singapore. Dr. Goh is largely responsible for this astoundingly, genuinely astoundingly, long list of Singapore institutions today. I mean, it's actually unbelievable. I think that his mum might be the first Asian mum to actually be proud of her son. Now you might be wondering, if he did as many things as he did, how come we haven't really heard about him? Now I refer you once again to what Mr. Lee Kuan Yew said.
He was a hopeless campaign orator, but a formidable analytical mind.
And like many public officials at the time, he was not self-promotional. He even declined to write his own autobiography. Maurice Baker, a pioneer generation diplomat, said that he preferred to work from behind the scenes and that he hated the leadership role. He always preferred to be working from the shadows. In this video, I'll cover the 5 main areas in which Dr. Goh has had the largest impact on Singapore: the economy, the currency, the reserves, the military, and the education system. Before I begin, welcome to What Makes a Country. I'm Kian Chong, your host, and on this channel, we uncover the hidden architecture behind successful countries. Let's start with the economy. In 1959, Singapore was in complete economic freefall. Unemployment was at 14%. That's a really high number. Everyone was desperately looking for a job. And with idle hands, they were lured more and more by the promises of communism, that the reason that they were out of a job is because of the capitalists. Lee Kuan Yew tasked Dr. Goh with the toughest job in government, and in this case, there was the finance minister. He was faced with a ticking time bomb: solve the job problem or risk Singapore being lost to communism. He recognized 3 key economic facts about Singapore. First, that trade alone would not create sufficient jobs for Singapore. He understood that even back then, during World War II, when Singapore's trade was booming, Singapore was the main supplier of rubber as well as tin to the rest of the world. Even then, there wasn't enough jobs being created for all of Singapore's residents. So he realized that even if, let's say, he were to double down on trade itself, there wouldn't be sufficient jobs for the new emerging population. Number 2, Singapore's status as open port. There was completely no tariffs and no trade barriers with any other country back then. This meant that the free entry of foreign goods into Singapore itself would create unexpected competition for any businessman. Number 3, that too much of the business and banking brains of Singapore were oriented towards trade and not towards industry and manufacturing. What does this mean? The businessmen at the time were very used to the fact that you could trade commodities and get back the capital and the returns within a few short days. You knew immediately whether you're going to be making a profit or not. But imagine if instead of that few short days of turnaround, you now have to wait years. And this is what it means to invest in a factory, because it takes years before you know whether your investment is going to be recouped and whether even you're going to be profitable or not. So Dr. Goh realized, based on these 3 economic facts, that the key to solving unemployment, the sky-high unemployment in Singapore, was to attract foreign investments. This was completely counter to conventional economic wisdom at the time, which was that if you were going to be developing your economy, what you needed to do was to do import substitution. And what this meant was that instead of importing goods from foreign countries, what you should be instead doing is that you produce domestically. So what you used to import, you now produce by yourself. This was a very common economic strategy that Malaysia and a whole other host of developing countries took back in the day. But because Singapore was such a small country, there was no way that we could actually do import substitution. Let's say you were producing something like a toilet bowl. How would you be able to just make 2 million toilet bowls for Singapore itself? There wasn't a large enough market to ensure that this strategy worked. So Dr. Goh racked his brain and decided to attract foreign investments instead. And what he did was to set up the Economic Development Board, better known as the EDB. The EDB went on to secure world-leading companies, including inking a deal with Apple to set up its first factory in Asia, in Singapore. And I speak more about this in this video right here. Because Singapore was still a fledgling country back then, investors wasn't full of confidence in Singapore. So Dr. Goh deployed what is commonly known as 移兵制计. And what this means is that just as a general were to place a few soldiers on the hills to make the enemy think that this army had a bigger army than they actually had, Dr. Goh deployed the very same tactic in attracting foreign investments. He will purposefully arrange for photo opportunities. He created an illusion of rapid industrialization to ensure that investors slowly build up confidence in Singapore. He ensured that every single stage of a factory opening in Singapore would be well publicized. So whether it was signing the agreement to laying the first foundation stone to when the factory was going to be opening, but actually not yet, he would still make sure that this was all appearing on the newspaper. Any foreign investments which was looking at Singapore back then would simply be seeing every single day on the newspaper there would be seemingly a factory opening. And this boosted investor confidence, and because what he realized was that external perception shaped economic reality. And in this case, this was key to building investor confidence. This boosted investor confidence when Singapore was the most vulnerable right after separation from Malaysia. Even the World Bank had completely written off Singapore's chances of survival separate from Malaysia. And well, were they proven wrong? Let's move on to finance. With the inflow of foreign investments into Singapore and the need to attract even more, Dr. Goh needed to make sure that the currency was as stable as it could be. And why was that so? Foreign investors, which were looking at Singapore as a potential investment destination, needed to make sure that the currency was not fluctuating every single year. This ensured that they could actually make proper plans and decide on whether any investment in Singapore was profitable or not. Imagine if the currency was fluctuating 20 to 30% every single year. How would you even begin to make basic business planning? You simply can't. In order to keep their currency stable, other developing countries were advised to set up a central bank, which meant the ability and the power to issue currencies at will. However, Dr. Goh went against the grain and decided on the currency board system instead, which was a British inheritance from 1906. It meant that for every Singapore dollar that was circulating, it was backed 100% by an asset in a Singapore reserve. This helped establish legitimacy in the newly circulating Singapore dollar. And this was just one of the key policy moves that Dr. Goh made. The global financial system itself was unraveling in the late 1960s. Sustained financial surpluses in Britain and the Suez Crisis led to the devaluation of the sterling in November 1967. America was no better. Its trade deficits undermined investor confidence in the dollar's convertibility to gold. France even sent its own warship to pick up its gold reserves with the dollar that it had. All this pressure from other countries eventually led Richard Nixon to take the dollar off the gold standard and allow the dollar to float in August 1971. With global investors losing confidence in the currencies of even the strongest economies, together with an oil shock, Singapore suffered inflations of up to 20% in 1973 and 1974. It was this traumatic episode that led Dr. Goh to formulate the idea of using exchange rates as a monetary policy to combat inflation. This policy had two key aspects to it. The first one is that the Singapore dollar would gradually appreciate in order to ensure that Singapore does not import too much inflation. This is because Singapore was an import-reliant economy. The second aspect to this was that the Singapore dollar would now be pegged to a basket of currencies of its trading partners and competitors. The Singapore dollar was allowed to fluctuate within a band. Once the Singapore dollar were to fluctuate above the band, the Singapore government would intervene and sell the Singapore dollar to weaken the Singapore dollar to keep it within the band itself. Singapore needed to have ample reserves to carry out this operation. And in order to do that, Dr. Goh pioneered the concept of diversifying the reserves across multiple currencies, which was unheard of at that time. Other countries which also managed their currencies simply kept their reserves in the reserve asset at the time, which was the US dollar. And you might be wondering now, why would Singapore use exchange rate as a monetary tool? The common discourse centered around using interest rates as well as controlling the money supply to combat inflation. Dr. Goh held the view that Singapore's openness to trade and capital meant the exchange rate was a superior mechanism to combat inflation. And this theory proved out true. During the second oil shock in the late 1970s and 80s, Singapore's inflation was kept at an even keel of around 6% in 1981 and 1982, while other OECD countries averaged at around 11%. This was a stunning demonstration of the effectiveness of using exchange rate as a monetary policy, which Singapore holds till today. Now let's move on to the reserves. GIC and Temasek, which are world-renowned today for being Singapore's sovereign wealth fund, were also Dr. Goh's brilliant solution to the unique problem that Singapore faces, which is that we have too much money. As an export powerhouse with persistent budget surpluses, together with the CPF system, which accumulates up to 35 to 50% of employees' wages, Singapore was accumulating much more reserves than necessary. Beyond what was needed to defend the Singapore dollar, excess amounts of reserve should be invested in stocks and bonds so that the Singapore reserves benefited from capital appreciation. While oil-rich nations have done this before, Singapore became the first non-commodity exporting country to set up a sovereign wealth fund, a model that is increasingly copied worldwide. Indonesia and America are two of the recent countries which have announced such a policy. Dr. Goh knew something that wasn't obvious at that time, that the Singapore reserves would go on to shape Singapore's economic destiny. This is the reason why he asked Mr. Kuan Yew to chair GIC, a notion that Mr. Lee wasn't entirely thrilled with, because it meant taking on more work. But Dr. Goh insisted that Mr. Lee do so, because it concerned the national security of Singapore. This foresight once again proved prescient. Today, the investment returns from the reserves generates up to over $20 billion a year, which contributes to the annual fiscal budget. This amounts to more than 20% of the government's revenue every single year, more than GST and personal income tax combined. A policy introduced in 2009 allowed the government to spend up to 50% of the future expected returns of the reserves. They have also become Singapore's lifeline in any crisis. During the recent COVID-19 pandemic, the government drew up to $40 billion, yes, $40 billion from the reserves to tide the economy through the crisis. This funded schemes such as the co-payment of employees' wages to prevent job losses, the co-sharing of risk so that the banks can continue lending, and guaranteeing deposits in commercial banks. Now let's talk about defense. When Singapore became independent in 1965, Dr. Goh was once again tasked with a seemingly impossible mission to create a Singapore army. Its defense force consisted of just 2 infantry battalions, with more Malaysians than Singaporeans, with a general that was actually sympathetic towards Malaysia. There was an active threat of Malaysia intervening to undo the separation. Harold Wilson, then British Prime Minister, had to go as far as warning the Tunku, the head of Malaysia, that if he were to arrest Lee Kuan Yew, it would be unwise for him to show up at the next Commonwealth Prime Minister conference. If not for Wilson, there might well have been a coup against Singapore. Meanwhile, Indonesia was waging its confrontation war against Singapore. Indonesia, under Sukarno, saw the Malayan Federation, Malaysia, Singapore, and the Borneo states as a new colonial plot. The situation wasn't just concerning, it was existential. Dr. Goh secretly reached out to the Israelis to help to build the Singapore army. It was similarly a small nation surrounded by larger neighbors. Soon, Mexicans started arriving in Singapore, actually Israeli officers in disguise. I'll leave you to connect the dot as to why they needed to disguise themselves. Dr. Goh wasn't just building an army, he was creating what he called a poisonous shrimp, a nation which may be small, but would be too painful to swallow. He was not a defeatist and deemed it foolish to allow ourselves to be hypnotized by the disparity in the population ratios between Singapore and her neighbours. What counts is the fighting strength of the armed forces, not the size of the population. The war-making potential of a small, vigorous, well-educated and highly motivated population should never be underestimated. Dr. Goh mastered defense matters, read up the classics on strategy.
He mastered defense matters, read up the classics on strategy, Sun Tzu, Clausewitz, Hitler. He subscribed to military journals to know the latest in military weaponry. And his only military background was as a corporal in the Singapore Volunteer Corps. He sent me books and articles, sideline and tract, insisting that I must know enough to decide what I had to approve. I had to read them to have a serious discussion with him on our options for strategy and arms purchases.
He delved into all the nuances of the military. Philip Yew recounted how one day, Dr. Goh asked him why we did not forge bombs like the Austrians, using casting, while Singapore was using iron forging and heat treating its mortar bombs. Philip Yew had to show him, after trial tests, that the Austrian bomb fragments were comparatively soft and did not go as far before Dr. Goh was satisfied. With his economist training, Dr. Goh deeply understood the importance of self-sufficiency and climbing up the value chain. A junior engineer shared a story of how he was summoned by Dr. Goh to strip down an M16 rifle and separate locally made parts from foreign-made imported parts. What was then apparent was that Singapore was focusing on manufacturing the lower value parts. He quickly made amends on that. Dr. Goh made sure that the army always had the capability to manufacture its own parts, whether it was higher or lower value. He set up the Chartered Industries of Singapore, which is today known as ST Engineering. Today, the armed forces continue to manufacture its own ammunitions and weapon systems. He also saw the value in Singapore having its own R&D capabilities, which resulted in the Defence Science Organisation, DSO Laboratories. Now let's move on to education. In 1979, Dr. Goh was put on the urgent task of reforming the Singapore education system. It was in a completely dire state. Dropout rates at the primary school level was at 29%. Secondary school even worse, at 36%. This was the highest compared to other countries like the UK, France, Japan or Taiwan. Worse still, less than 40% of students achieve basic competency in English and their mother tongue, Malay, Mandarin and Tamil. Dr. Goh recognized that the system was drastically failing its students. The philosophy of education had to change to one that attempted to provide the best possible education for all students according to their abilities. This led to the introduction of streaming at the primary 3 and primary 6 levels. Around 9 and 12 years old, English was also decided to be the language of instruction and of government. The streaming policy was highly controversial. It became a lightning rod for Singapore's overemphasis on academic performance. Academically weaker students often felt stigmatized for not performing as well as their peers. But Dr. Goh stuck to his guns. The results were dramatic. By 1985, dropout rates had fallen at a primary school level from 29% to 8%, and at the secondary school level from 36% to 6%. This was a dramatic reversal. So despite the controversy of the streaming system, it had actually achieved its goal of reducing dropout rates. What was important to note was that Dr. Goh himself always rallied against the notion of overemphasis on education. He said that the preoccupation in Singapore with examination results is unnatural and unhealthy, and we should bring it to an end as early as possible. He argued that not enough time was spent on the physical and moral side of life. Gradually, the education system has been oriented towards the one that it is today, where students of different abilities are grouped according to their strengths in different subjects. When Dr. Goh decided to leave politics in 1984, Mr. Kuan Yew wrote to him this letter: "No panegyric can do justice to you. A whole generation of Singaporeans take their present standard of living for granted because you had laid the foundations of the economy of modern Singapore, and you catered for more than bare living. Singaporeans who bring their children to the Bird Park, Chinese Garden, Japanese Garden, Jurong Golf Club or Sentosa, or who listen to the Singapore Symphony Orchestra, owe their pleasures to you. You convince me that if we are to achieve our long-term aspirations for Singaporeans, then, as a people, we must begin to have some feeling for the aesthetic in life." Yes, you heard that right. He was also responsible for all of those things. While Lee Kuan Yew became the face of the success of modern Singapore, it was often Dr. Goh who was working behind the scenes to resolve the toughest problems that were faced in government. Singapore needed both men, the charismatic leader and the brilliant problem solver. Both of these men together helped to transform Singapore from a vulnerable island into the successful story that it is known for today. If you enjoy raving over Dr. Goh as much as I did, please feel free to share this story with someone else who might know of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, but not so much of the man that he will be lost without, Dr. Goh Keng Swee. And tell me in the comment section, which of Dr. Goh's policies or innovations made the most difference to Singapore